The goat pen door, half off its leather hinges and creaking with every push of the wind, was the first thing she saw clearly in the failing light. It looked like a palace. It promised a barrier, however flimsy, against the vast, cold scrubland of the Nevada Territory in 1878. For a girl with nothing left but the clothes on her back and a battered suitcase, a barrier was everything. Jesse Calloway watched her from his porch, the oil and steel of the rifle he was cleaning cool against his hands. He had seen the flicker of movement out by his property line an hour ago and had been waiting, still as the dusk, to see what it was. Not a coyote. Not a stray longhorn. It was a person, small and hunched, moving with the exhaustion of someone who had been walking for a very long time. Now, she stood hesitating by the low fence of the goat enclosure, her gaze fixed on that broken door. He set the rifle down carefully, making no sudden moves. He was a quiet man on a quiet homestead, and he preferred to keep it that way. The nearest town, Argenta, was a 10-mile ride, and its citizens considered him standoffish, a man who kept to his own counsel. They weren't wrong. He'd had enough of men and their noise in the war. Now he wanted only the bleating of his goats, the whistle of the wind, and the silence of the high desert. The figure turned, startled, as he stepped off the porch. It was a girl, younger than he'd thought, maybe 18. Chinese. Her face was smudged with dust, her dark trousers and tunic patched and worn thin. She clutched the handle of a heavy-looking suitcase as if it were an anchor. She saw him and froze, a cornered animal weighing its chances. He stopped a good 20 feet away, holding his hands out, palms open, to show they were empty. "You're on private land," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. She flinched at the sound but held her ground. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. When she was close enough, she pointed a trembling finger toward the goat pen. Her voice was a mere whisper, cracked with thirst and fear. "Please," she said, the English word rough and unfamiliar on her tongue. "Sleep." Here she pointed again, more insistently this time, at the dusty ground inside the pen, where a half-dozen goats watched her with placid, yellow eyes. Jessie looked from her desperate face to the pen. The ground was hard-packed dirt and manure. The air was thick with the smell of goat. He thought of the night ahead, the temperature dropping fast, the coyotes that yipped and howled from the ridges after sundown. He knew what the folks in Argenta would say. He knew the talk it would cause. The railroad had brought hundreds of Chinese laborers to the territory, and with them came suspicion and resentment. A lone man, taking in a lone Chinese girl, it was trouble he didn't need. He had a homestead to prove, a debt at the general store, and a past he'd rather keep buried. But then he looked at her again. She wasn't a problem or a political statement. She was just a girl, alone and at the end of her rope. Leaving her to the elements was not a thing he could put his name to. Something in his chest, a thing he thought long dead and buried in a field in Tennessee, wouldn't allow it. He shook his head, not in refusal, but in redirection. He pointed with his chin toward the large, sturdy barn that stood behind his small clapboard house. "Hayloft," he said. "Warmer. Drier." Relief washed over her face so completely it was like watching the sun rise. But suspicion followed it just as quickly. She eyed him, then the barn, her grip tightening on her suitcase. He understood. He sighed, a sound of profound weariness, and turned his back on her. He walked to the water pump near his porch, worked the handle until cool, clear water gushed out, and filled a tin cup. He set it on the porch railing, along with a thick slice of bread left over from his supper. Then he walked back to his front door without looking at her. "Door to the barn ain't barred," he called over his shoulder. "There's blankets on a hook by the ladder." He went inside, shutting his own door behind him. He didn't light a lamp. He stood in the dark, listening. He heard the scrape of the tin cup on the wood railing, the sound of long, desperate swallows. A few minutes later, the heavy groan of the barn door opening, then closing. He lay on his cot for hours, fully dressed, the rifle now resting against the wall beside him. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of what he had just done. He had invited the world, with all its complications and judgments, into his quiet life. He didn't know her name, where she'd come from, or who, if anyone, might be looking for her. He only knew she was now sleeping in his barn, and that simple fact had changed everything. The next morning, Jesse rose before the sun, a habit ingrained from years of solitude. He stepped outside into the crisp, cool air, expecting the barn door to be open, the girl and her suitcase gone. Instead, the door was shut tight. He walked over to the goat pen to check on a nanny that was due to kid. He stopped dead. The broken door, which had been hanging crookedly for a month, was now fixed. It swung smoothly on its hinges, secured not with new leather, but with a clever, intricate weave of baling wire he'd left coiled by the fence. It was a better repair than he could have managed himself. He stared at it for a long moment before moving on. He found her in the small corral beside the barn. She wasn't sleeping. She was standing perfectly still, her hand outstretched to his young filly, a skittish creature he'd been struggling to gentle for weeks. The horse, which usually shied from his touch, had its head lowered, its muzzle nudging the girl's palm as she murmured to it in a soft, melodic language he didn't understand. She saw him and immediately pulled her hand back, taking a step away from the horse as if caught doing something wrong. She began, her English still hesitant. "It's all right," he said, his voice softer than the night before. "She doesn't take to many folks." He noticed her suitcase sitting neatly by the corral fence. She hadn't run. He knew he had a choice to make. He was low on flour and salt, a trip to Argenta he could no longer postpone. He couldn't leave her here alone, a clear sign to any passing rider that he was harboring someone. But taking her into town was like lighting a fuse. He made his decision. "I have to go to town," he told her, gesturing to his buckboard wagon. "You'll come?" Fear fled in her eyes. "No. Town no good. Staying here is worse," he said flatly. "Get in the wagon." Under the canvas. She hesitated, her gaze darting from his face to the open country around them. Finally, she gave a small, jerky nod. She lifted her heavy suitcase into the wagon bed, then climbed in after it, pulling the dusty canvas over herself until she disappeared. The ride to Argenta was tense. Jesse could feel her presence behind him, a small, warm weight under the canvas. When he pulled the wagon up in front of Finch General Store, the main street was busy with ranchers and townsfolk. Barton Finch himself was standing on the boardwalk, a portly man with a watch chain stretched tight across his vest. He held the note on Jesse's land, a fact he never let Jesse forget. "Calloway," Finch said, his tone oozing a false cordiality. "Come for more credit? That goat herd turning a profit yet, or are they still keeling over on you?" "Just supplies, Finch," Jesse said, keeping his voice even. "And I'm paying cash." He made a point of pulling a few worn silver coins from his pocket. Finch's eyes narrowed. As Jesse started to list what he needed, flour, salt, coffee, cartridges, a stray dog began barking furiously at the back of the wagon, sniffing and scratching at the canvas. "What you got there, Calloway?" Finch asked, his curiosity piqued. "Nothing that concerns you." But it was too late. The girl, startled by the dog, must have shifted. The canvas moved. Finch's eyes lit up with malicious glee. He strode over to the wagon, and before Jesse could move to stop him, he ripped the canvas away. The girl sat there, blinking in the sudden, harsh sunlight, clutching her suitcase. The street fell silent. Every eye turned to them. A low murmur went through the small crowd. Finch let out a sneering laugh. Well. Looks like the railroad lost some of its property. Didn't know you were in the business of harboring runaways, Calloway. What's your finder's fee?" The insult hung in the air, thick and ugly. Jesse felt a hot rage build in his throat. He could have made an excuse, claimed he'd just found her, that he was taking her to the marshal. It would have been the easy way out. It would have saved his reputation and smoothed things over with Finch. Instead, he walked deliberately to the side of the wagon and held out his hand to the girl. She looked at his offered hand, then at his face, her own expression a mask of terror and confusion. He kept his hand steady until she hesitantly placed hers in it. He helped her down, his grip firm and protective. He stood beside her, facing Finch and the entire town of Argenta. "She's helping on my claim," Jesse said, his voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even himself. "It's my business who I hire." He turned his back on Finch, leaving the store owner sputtering. He guided the girl across the street to the wagon rides, bought the leather strips he needed for the goat pen, and loaded them into the buckboard. He did it all with a slow, deliberate calm, aware of every whisper, every stare. He was drawing a line in the dust of Argenta's main street, and he knew it. As they prepared to leave, his eyes caught a piece of paper tacked to the wall of the telegraph office. It wasn't a wanted poster for a criminal with a bounty. It was a notice, printed in stark black letters. It offered a $50 reward for information leading to the return of runaway Chinese labor from the Central Pacific Work Camp No. 9. There was no picture, only a description: female, young, last seen heading south from the rail line. A cold certainty settled in Jess's gut. $50 was a fortune. It was more than enough to pay off his debt to Finch. And it was a clear sign that someone powerful was looking for the quiet girl sitting in his wagon. The trouble he had feared was no longer a vague possibility. It now had a name and a price. The ride back to the homestead was silent, the air thick with unspoken questions. The public confrontation had changed something between them. He had claimed her as his own responsibility, and now they were bound by the consequences. That evening, after the chores were done, Jesse found her by the corral. She wasn't looking at the horses. She was staring up at the sky, a vast canopy of stars undimmed by any city's glow. She had her suitcase open on the ground beside her. It was filled mostly with threadbare clothes, but on top lay a small, exquisitely embroidered silk pouch. He approached quietly and held out a blanket. She took it with a murmur of thanks. For a while, they stood in shared silence, the only sounds the soft stamping of the horses and the distant call of a night bird. "What's your name?" he finally asked. "Leanne," she said, her voice soft. "Jesse." He gestured to the open suitcase. "You travel light." She looked down at her meager belongings, then back at him. A decision seemed to pass over her face. "I ran," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "From the railroad camp." "I figured as much," he said gently. "The notice in town." Her eyes widened in fear. "They look for me." "A man named Sterling is looking for you," he corrected, guessing the notice came from a specific boss, not the company itself. "A foreman?" She nodded, her body tense. She began to speak, her English halting but driven by a desperate need to be understood. She told him of the journey from her village, the promises of work in a place called California, the brutal reality of the labor camps. Sterling wasn't just a foreman. He held the papers, the debts, the very lives of the workers he oversaw. He'd bought them from the shipping agents in San Francisco. And he had decided he wanted more from Leanne than just labor. "He say?" "I be his wife," she whispered, the word tasting like poison. "Not real wife. His thing. He come for me. I run." Jesse felt that old, cold anger again, the kind he hadn't felt since the war. It was the anger of seeing the powerful crush the weak simply because they could. Leanne reached into her suitcase and picked up the small silk pouch. She carefully untied the drawstring and poured the contents into her palm. It wasn't gold or jewels. It was seeds. Dozens of tiny, dark seeds of all shapes and sizes. "From my home," she explained, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. "For a garden. For my own place." He looked from the seeds in her hand to her determined face. It was the simplest dream imaginable, and the most profound. It was the same dream that had driven him to this desolate patch of Nevada, the dream of owning a piece of ground and making something grow. In that moment, he understood that he wasn't just hiding a runaway. He was protecting a fellow homesteader. A few days later, the world he'd invited in arrived on horseback. The rider was a big man on a fine black gelding, dressed in a tailored coat and clean boots that looked out of place on the dusty track to Jess's land. He moved with an easy arrogance, his smile confident and predatory. It was Sterling. He reined in his horse near the porch where Jesse was standing. He didn't dismount. "Afternoon," Sterling said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I'm looking for some property that went missing from my camp. A girl. I was told in town she might have headed this way." "Lots of folks head this way," Jesse said, his hands resting loosely at his sides. "Doesn't mean they stop." Sterling's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This one is particular. About so high," he gestured, "Chinese. Answers to no name you'd know. But she belongs to me. I have the papers to prove it." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. An indenture contract. A bill of sale for a human being. He saw the flicker in Jess's eyes. "Look, farmer," Sterling said, his tone shifting to one of man-to-man conspiracy. "I know how it is. A man gets lonely. But she's a runner. More trouble than she's worth. You return her, and the $50 reward is yours. I'll even make it $100. Enough to clear your slate with that leech finch in town, I'd wager." The offer hung in the air, tempting and foul. $100. It would mean freedom from debt. It would mean he could buy the breeding ram he needed, fix the roof before winter. It would mean survival. All he had to do was trade one person's life for his own peace of mind. He thought of his struggling homestead, the years of back-breaking work that could all be undone by one bad season or one called-in loan. He thought of the constant, grinding worry that was his companion from sunup to sundown. Then he pictured Leanne, her hands carefully tending to the filly, her face full of hope as she showed him the seeds. He met Sterling's gaze. "There's no one here by that description," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're on private land. I suggest you leave." Sterling's smile vanished. The politeness dropped away like a mask, revealing the raw menace beneath. "That's a mistake, Calloway. A costly one. I'll be back. And when I come back, I'll take what's mine. And I'll burn the rest of this pathetic dirt patch to the ground." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, ringing threat behind him. Jesse stood watching until he was gone. He had made his choice. He had chosen a person over a profit, a garden of seeds over $100 silver. He had chosen to stand his ground, and now he would have to face the fire. For months later, the first chill of autumn was in the air. The fierce Nevada summer had given way to cool nights and golden afternoons. The homestead was transformed. Beside the small clapboard house, where only dust and sagebrush had been, was a thriving garden. Strange, leafy greens, plump melons Jesse had never seen before, and delicate, climbing beans grew in neat, impossible rows. Leanne seeds, nurtured with tireless patience and water hauled bucket by bucket from the pump, had flourished. The garden not only fed them but gave them a surplus, which Jesse traded for goods with a friendly freighter who passed through monthly, completely bypassing Barton Finch's store and his sour disposition. The goat herd was also transformed. Leanne had a quiet, uncanny way with animals. She seemed to know when one was sick before it showed any sign, treating them with herbal poultices and a gentle touch. The herd was now healthy and growing, the nannies producing more milk and stronger kids than ever before. For the first time since he'd filed his claim, Jesse saw the real possibility of profit. Sterling had been true to his word. He returned a week after his first visit, this time with 2 rough-looking men at his back. But Jesse was no simple farmer. He was a man who had survived the horrors of Shiloh, a man who knew how to read the land and use it as a weapon. And he was not alone. There was no grand shootout. They didn't have the ammunition for it. Instead, they used what they had, knowledge and preparation. A tripwire made of scavenged telegraph cable sent Sterling's horse tumbling in a narrow ravine. A carefully thrown rock started a small landslide of shale that separated him from his men. Leanne, hidden in the rocks above, let out a piercing shriek that spooked the hired men's horses, sending them bucking and scattering across the valley. It was chaos, humiliation, and surprise, not bullets, that won the day. Sterling left with a broken arm and a shattered pride. He never came back. A quiet word to the U.S. Marshal in the territorial capital from Jess's freighter friend had prompted an investigation into labor practices at Camp No. 9, and Sterling and his indenture papers had vanished. Finch, deprived of his leverage, was forced to accept Jess's payments in cash, his power over the homestead broken one garden vegetable at a time. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Jesse stood on his porch. It was repaired now, the floorboards level and solid. He watched Leanne moving through her garden, her hands gently tending the plants. The home was different now, too. Curtains, sewn from bleached flour sacks and embroidered with colored thread she had painstakingly unraveled from her own worn clothing, hung in the windows. The place felt less like a shelter and more like a home. He held a piece of paper in his hand, the corners softened from being carried in his pocket for a week. It was a new filing he'd picked up from the land office. He walked down the steps and across the yard to where she was working. She looked up as he approached, her face smudged with the dark, rich soil of her garden. She smiled, a real, unguarded smile that made something loosen in his chest. He didn't say a word. He simply unfolded the paper and held it out for her to see. On the line for the claimant of the homestead, he had written his name, Jesse Calloway. And right beside it, in the same careful, steady hand, he had written another, Leanne. She looked from the paper to his face, her eyes searching his. He saw a flicker of disbelief, then a wave of understanding, and finally, a deep, quiet joy that was more beautiful than any sunrise. They hadn't found a sudden fortune or a storybook romance. They had simply taken a desolate piece of land and, through shared work and quiet courage, built a life. They had planted a garden in the desert and made it bloom. And in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the West, they had discovered that was more than enough. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.